The library was nearly empty. Most of the students had already left. The long rows of bookshelves stood quietly beneath warm overhead lights, while the faint sound of pages turning echoed through the silence, and the city beyond the windows slowly disappeared into evening darkness. And despite the calm atmosphere, one corner of the building carried a different kind of weight, because being ignored created a loneliness that crowded places often cannot cure. A young man sat alone at a wooden table. A notebook lay open before him. Weeks of effort, months of work, ideas, projects, contributions, and yet it felt as though none of it mattered. At work, his efforts went unnoticed. In conversations, people spoke over him. His messages received short replies or none at all. His achievements passed without acknowledgement. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't rejection. It was something stranger. Absence. The feeling of becoming invisible while standing in plain sight. And somehow that hurt more than criticism, because criticism at least confirms your existence. Being ignored makes people question it. The young man stared at the notebook, then at the empty chairs surrounding him, and finally toward Friedrich Nietzsche, who stood quietly between the shelves observing the room. Not the silence, but the meaning attached to it. After several moments, the young man finally spoke and asked a question that countless people secretly carry. How do you keep going when nobody seems to notice? The library remained silent. The lights remained warm. And Nietzsche did not answer immediately, because some questions require a person to hear the silence before they can hear the truth. The library remained silent. Rows of books stretched endlessly beneath warm lights. The city outside continued moving through the evening, unaware of quiet struggle unfolding inside one of its oldest buildings. And yet, somehow, the silence felt heavier now, because once a person begins to feel invisible, every interaction starts carrying new meaning. And the young man sitting alone at the wooden table felt that weight pressing against every memory he replayed, every conversation he remembered, every moment he had felt overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten, because invisibility rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates. One ignored comment, one unanswered message, one forgotten contribution, one overlooked achievement at a time, until eventually a person begins asking a dangerous question. Maybe I don't matter. The young man stared at the notebook before him. The pages were filled with work, ideas, effort, hours nobody had seen. And after several silent moments, he looked toward Friedrich Nietzsche. Then he asked another question. Why do I care so much whether people notice me? The question carried something deeper now. Not frustration, not sadness, but dependence. And dependence is dangerous because it often disguises itself as normal human behavior. Nietzsche answered calmly. He said that most people do not want attention. They want confirmation. The words settled heavily into the quiet library because suddenly the problem looked different. Perhaps the pain was not caused by being ignored. Perhaps it was caused by what being ignored seemed to imply. The implication that he was unimportant, insignificant, forgettable. And Nietzsche continued. He said that many people unknowingly build their self-worth from reflections, from praise, from recognition, from approval, from the reactions of other people. And as long as those reflections remain positive, everything feels stable. But the moment the reflections disappear, so does their sense of value. The young man remained silent because something inside him had already begun to shift. Not confidence, not relief, awareness. And awareness is always uncomfortable because it exposes invisible dependencies. A student nearby quietly closed the textbook. The sound echoed softly through the library. And Nietzsche continued. He said that attention is one of the most misunderstood forms of validation. People assume that being noticed means being valuable, and being ignored means being worthless. But those are not the same thing. The words moved deeper than anything before them, because they challenged a belief the young man had carried for years. The belief that visibility and value were connected, that recognition and worth were connected, that being seen and mattering were connected. And Nietzsche continued. He said that some of the most valuable things in existence operate almost entirely unnoticed. Roots grow beneath the ground. Foundations remain hidden beneath buildings. The strongest parts of a tree are often invisible. Yet without them, everything collapses. The young man looked down because he recognized exactly what Nietzsche meant. Much of his work happened quietly. Much of his growth happened privately. Much of his effort happened long before results became visible. And yet he judged all of it through the attention it received. The library remained still. The books remained untouched around them. And Nietzsche continued. He said that the modern world trains people to measure themselves through visibility, followers, likes, recognition, status, public acknowledgement. And when attention becomes a measurement of value, people begin chasing attention instead of substance. The words settled into the room with quiet force because they exposed something far deeper than loneliness. They exposed dependence on external confirmation, a dependence so common that most people never question it. The young man slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time that evening, he was no longer thinking about the people who ignored him. He was thinking about the power he had given them, the power to determine how valuable he felt, the power to influence how he viewed himself. And Nietzsche noticed, so he continued. He said that one of the greatest forms of freedom is learning to recognize your value before the world recognizes it. The words echoed softly between the shelves, because what they were feeling was no longer disappointment. It was something far more unsettling, a growing realization that the pain of being ignored may not come from other people at all. It may come from expecting them to provide something they were never responsible for in the first place. The library remained silent. The city lights continued glowing beyond the windows. And for the first time since entering the building, the young man was no longer asking why nobody noticed him. He was beginning to ask something far more important. What if his value had never depended on being noticed at all? The library remained quiet. The shelves still stretched into the distance. The warm light still illuminated rows of books filled with ideas, discoveries, and stories written by people who once sat alone with nothing but their thoughts. Nothing had changed. And yet, somehow, everything felt different. Because something had shifted, not in the people who had overlooked him, not in the messages that never received replies, not in the conversations where his voice went unheard, but in the way he now understood value itself. And that difference was enough to change everything. Because once a person begins to separate their worth from the attention of others, the entire structure of their life begins to change. And the silence of the library seemed to carry that realization through every shelf and every empty table surrounding them, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist. Something that had already begun to alter the way the young man understood recognition, importance, approval, and the invisible need to be seen. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous. Not because it changes other people, but because it changes you. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood calmly among the shelves, not as someone who had always been understood, but as someone who had stopped demanding understanding from a crowd. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because most people spend their lives trying to become visible. Very few spend their lives becoming valuable. The young man sat silently. The ignored messages still existed. The lack of recognition still existed. Nothing practical had changed, and yet something inside him no longer felt empty. Then he asked one final question. The question hidden beneath every feeling of invisibility. The question hidden beneath every desire for recognition. What if nobody ever notices? The library seemed quieter after he asked it, not because the silence deepened, but because the question reached beyond attention. It reached meaning. Nietzsche answered calmly. He said that the crowd notices many things and forgets most of them. The words settled heavily into the room because they exposed something uncomfortable. Attention is temporary. Value is not. And Nietzsche continued. He said that many people spend their lives chasing visibility, trying to be admired, trying to be recognized, trying to be acknowledged. And when those things fail to arrive, they assume they have failed as well. But recognition and worth are not the same thing. The young man listened carefully, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer thinking about the people who ignored him. He was thinking about the standards he used to judge himself. And Nietzsche continued. He said that some of the most important work in human history was done long before it was appreciated. Some ideas were ignored. Some discoveries were dismissed. Some people died without seeing the impact of what they created. Yet their value existed before recognition arrived. The words echoed softly between the shelves, because they did not promise attention. They demanded patience. And patience is always heavier than validation. A faint breeze touched the windows. The city lights beyond the glass shimmered against the darkness. And suddenly the young man understood something he had been unable to see before. He had spent years asking the wrong question. Not, why don't they see me? But, why do I need them to? The realization settled deeply within him because it shifted responsibility. The people around him could continue overlooking him. The world could continue moving without applause. Recognition could continue arriving slowly. But none of those things were capable of determining his worth unless he allowed them to. A long silence settled over the library. Then Nietzsche slowly turned toward the exit. The shadows between the shelves seemed deeper now, the building quieter. And before leaving, he spoke one final time. He said that the strongest people are not those who receive the most attention. They are the ones who continue building, learning, creating, and growing even when nobody is watching. The words settled over the library with quiet finality because they did not promise recognition. They did not promise admiration. They did not promise that the crowd would eventually understand. They promised something far more important: self-respect. Because self-respect survives silence. Self-respect survives invisibility. Self-respect survives neglect. And no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to demand from the world, nothing left to negotiate with the crowd, nothing left to prove. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared into the quiet darkness beyond the bookshelves, the young man remained exactly where he was. The library was still silent. The world was still busy. The recognition still had not arrived. And yet he no longer felt the same. Because once a person realizes that their value is not measured by attention, they stop waiting to be seen and start becoming who they were meant to be.